Hey, Andrew, you there?
I'm here.
All right, nice to talk with you. So, let's see. Andrew, let's first welcome you to Blogging Heads. And you want to sort of tell us a little bit about yourself? You're in a very far, far away place, is that correct?
I'm talking to you today from Damascus, Syria, and I've been here for about the last 6 years on and off. I do two main things. One is I'm a fellow with the Institute of Current World Affairs, which is a U.S. institute now based in Washington, D.C. And a few years ago, I helped a few Syrian friends start a magazine called Syria Today, which is an English language magazine that covers Syrian current affairs, and it's one of the only independent magazines operating in Syria today.
And you also have a blog, I believe, correct?
That's right. I blog, and it's also a compilation of, I guess, also my work as well. It's andrewtabler.com. And I talk mostly about Syrian affairs. I also talk about Lebanese affairs. The name of the blog is called Eighth Gate, and the reason is very simple. The old city of Damascus had 7 gates, and in my blog, the Eighth Gate, tries to look at who is coming in and out of Damascus and what are they talking about. And it specifically focuses on U.S. foreign policy concerning Syria.
U.S. foreign policy concerning Syria. That's the hyper-specific focus of your blog.
Yes, but also, I mean, I cover also a lot of Syrian affairs and whatever really comes up. So if you're interested in Syria, it's a good place to get maybe a critical view of what's going on now.
Well, that's good. Well, speaking of plugs for blogs, I should just introduce myself for the podcast. I guess they're listeners out there. I guess they could be viewers too. I'm not really sure the technicals. But in any case, so I used to, let's see, what did I do? I used to write the Today's Papers column for Slate. And I, of course, have my own blog, umansky.com. And just as it happens, I'm going to be heading to Damascus in roughly 3 days to be studying Arabic there through the end of the year.
Ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So this is my primer on how to survive in Damascus and not get in trouble in any respect. All right, so we have all of our backgrounds out of the way. So we could talk about we're now in the summer. The thing that caught my eye, particularly as a guy who's about to travel to Damascus on Monday, was this talk in the kind of blogosphere about the summer war. You know, I mean, this struck me as obviously kind of highly speculative, but it was pegged to this interim report. Is it interim report? Is that a fair way to describe it?
That's right.
The UN.
That's right.
You want to just give the background about it? That's about the assassination of the former prime minister of Lebanon, Hariri.
Sure.
Right. What was the deal with that?
Well, in February of 2004, the former Lebanese prime minister Rafik Hariri, a man who had worked for a number of years to rebuild Lebanon with the cooperation of Saudi Arabia, the United States, and also of Syria. On February 14th of 2005, he was killed in a massive explosion in downtown Beirut, and there has been an international investigation into his murder. And the international investigation has been focusing for some time for the last 2 years, on trying to get to the bottom of this case. And at the moment, actually the latest report by the now chief investigator Serge Bremertz into the murder was released yesterday. Was actually leaked to journalists yesterday, and I think is available today. It's available on my blog. The copy's available on my blog right now. Basically, it focuses on two theories. One is that in terms of the nitty gritty, the forensics evidence and who actually carried it out. They're pursuing a line that some sort of jihadi movement operating in Lebanon carried out the murder.
Which is to say less likely than Syria. In other words, that
well,
to point the finger away from Syria.
Well, at the same time, it's very interesting. The investigator is a really good chess player, and he knows the regional politics involved between Syria, who's traditionally been dominant over its traditional client state, Lebanon. It is also pursuing a line, and it says very clearly throughout the report that it is the political environment surrounding Hariri's murder, and specifically before that, the Syrian-led extension of Hariri's rival, President Emil Lahoud of Lebanon.
He was sort of a Syrian.
He was a very pro-Syrian, very pro-Syrian president of Lebanon, and his term was extended, and they had to actually change the constitution, and Hariri was pressured to do that in September, actually late August and early September of 2004, and they think that was the political environment that caused the chain of events that led to his murder. So it's very interesting investigation. The motives concern regional politics, and the actual carrying out of the murder involve other aspects of regional politics that we see, specifically concerning the use of IEDs and other kinds of devices to hit certain individuals here in the region, and also U.S. troops in Iraq, of course.
I mean, without, with sort of knowing that we don't really know in the end, and there's no use in doing too much speculation, the sort of thought that pops to my mind is sort of subcontracting job. Is that something that, seems like a line of possibility?
Well, okay, the Assad regime is a Ba'athist secular regime, which and it's very similar to the arguments you will see a number of individuals who are very pro-Syria, who support the Syrian regime, say, well, there was no link between Al Qaeda and Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime as well, and I think on the surface that's correct. But in the case of Syria, while ideologies might not have matched, they might have had common interests, and I don't know. I mean, and we won't know. And this is going to be handed over to an international tribunal, which has just been formed, and will be trying certain individuals, which the international tribunal calls, in a third country outside of Lebanon and Syria. It involves foreign and Lebanese judges, and basically what could happen is that we could be seeing a situation where, and again, this is speculative, but the investigation is going along these ways, so I can speak, relatively confidently, that we could see that elements within a completely secular Ba'athist regime could have ordered a group which they have no ideological affiliation with, and if they were probably face-to-face would hate each other, to carry out a murder on a head of state of a neighboring country. And it really turns Middle East politics upside down. We don't know for sure, but a close reading of the last report released yesterday, and the previous reports, which come out about every 3 months now, are pushing the investigation in this direction. So this is where we're headed for the upcoming tribunal.
And in terms of the connection, I mean, for me, I see this talk, which I saw you link to a piece about it on your website. Joshua Landis linked to, who's an academic who's actually in Syria for the summer, correct? Anyway, he linked to he linked to something about the summer potentials for a summer war on his website as well. It strikes me as all, I mean, kind of more than guesswork, is some mix between guesswork and sort of hyperbolic guesswork. But I'm curious whether you see you sort of disagree with that and actually see a sort of significant chance of it, or something that's really kind of real sort of evidence of any ramping up. Or, by the way, we're talking about a war that would somehow involve Israel, presumably Hezbollah, Syria, some triangle therein, right?
Right. Since the day the ceasefire took place in Lebanon last year, I have heard a number of sources saying that there will be another war this summer.
By the way, why is it always a summer war? I mean, what's the?
It's very interesting. In the Middle East, usually people talk about the winds, and I guess we could roughly translate it as the winds of change. Normally they blow in the fall, as they do in the northern hemisphere, and also in the spring. But in the summer, when the temperatures go up and the air gets stale and dry, or in the case of Beirut, very, very muggy, people's tempers tend to go up, and
like riots usually happen in the summer.
A lot of riots happen in the summer. It's just not very pleasant, and in the sun, it's quite punishing. And in any case, they felt a number of people felt that Israel, as a result of the last war, had lost one major thing, and I tend to agree with this, and that is that they had lost the deterrent, the sort of deterrence that Ariel Sharon had always talked about against, that would convince Arab regimes as well as their people not to attack Israel. Since
sort of,
sorry,
yeah. No, just this is the sort of Israel wants a mulligan, theory.
Something like that. Well, now what makes this more acute than in the past is that in the past conflicts with Israel were waged largely with conventional forces, with the addition of Fedayeen and other kinds of Palestinian groups, which carried out attacks across the Israeli borders. Now, Hezbollah's performance last year changed everything, and Syrians were overwhelmingly affected last summer by Israel's bombing of civilian targets in Lebanon, and this lost Israel and the United States large parts of the sort of media or public diplomacy war in the region. And so a lot of Syrians started saying, hey, why don't we carry out similar attacks across the Golan Heights, which has been the demilitarized zone between the Syrian forces and Israeli forces on the Golan Heights, has been the quietest front that Israel has seen since 1973, I believe. And these are their words, not mine. So what we saw, and I wrote on this a number of times, back actually as early as January or February, is that we saw a lot of popular committees in Syria organizing for resistance activities in the Golan Heights. Then we saw
popular committees are, sorry, what?
Well, popular committees are kind of like, actually they're headed by former sort of regime functionaries who basically they were information. The people I interviewed were information campaigns, information efforts to try to get, because it had been this is the 40th anniversary since Israel captured the Golan Heights in 1967. So about 500,000 Syrians have been displaced from their homes for about 40 years. There had been no settlement. So the popular committees were talking about highlighting these activities. But at the same time, then there was a more militarist dimension to this, and then a number of groups of various names were claiming to, that they had captured an Israeli soldier in 1997 and were holding them hostage. We saw a report that the Israeli forces in the Golan had found about 7 or 8 unexploded Israeli mines that were dug up on the Syrian side of the DMZ and thrown over the fence line. And we had also heard a report about a supposed burning or protests in the 5 predominantly Druze and Alawite villages that still contain Syrians on the Golan Heights.
On the Israeli side. On
the Israeli-controlled side, yeah. Anyways, so this kind of brewed for a while, and nobody really talked about it. Then suddenly, some strange reports started coming out over the last week in response to the Israelis carrying out quite large military exercises on the Golan Heights. And now a report came out that said that a senior Syrian Ba'ath official had given an interview to who looks like an Israeli source with a dateline on the story of the Golan Heights, which means he's probably on the Israeli side. It's a bit odd for Syrian officials to call up Israeli journalists. And basically, the official said, "Look, to Israel, if you do not evacuate the Golan Heights by August or September, we are going to launch resistance activities against Jewish settlements on the Golan Heights immediately.
And yeah.
Now,
what's the precedent? I mean, in other words,
there is no precedent for that.
Really?
Not that I know of. I mean, there have been a few hiccups here, there, and everywhere, but again, spending this amount of time in the Levant over the last 6 years, and actually about 13 years in the region totally, I have never come across such bellicose statements from the Syrian side, and specifically concerning these kind of attacks.
These kind of attacks meaning
Hezbollah-style resistance attacks with, sort of rocket-propelled grenade launchers and anti-tank missiles. Basically, a number of Syrian advisors have told me in interviews that the secrets of last summer's war, were sort of very, mobile and quick, quick young youth with anti-tank missiles and rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and this was enough to basically stop the Israeli army in its tracks. And the fact that was happening, that these kind of statements were coming out, plus the Israelis became concerned when the Syrians removed checkpoints going down to the area of separation around the city of Quneitra, which is the main city in the Golan, and very close to
So in other words, like there was a sort of demilitarized zone that they were policing, and they sort of walked away from their posts, is what you're saying?
Well, if you remove the checkpoints, that means everybody can just go down there, which is not normal. Normally they stop people, including foreigners, and ask for permission. And since anybody could go down there, then that means that anybody could jump across the fence line or do whatever and carry out resistance activities on their own. So basically, the Israeli side was saying, well, we're becoming very concerned that you're allowing people close to the DMZ. And this is also unprecedented. This is usually a very heavily controlled area, and the Syrian security services, which are renowned for their ability to keep order, have supposedly walked away from those positions. So it seemed to be inching its way towards some kind of conflict, possibly, and suddenly, in the middle of all of this, Olmert, the Israeli prime minister, who had gone to Washington recently, came back and said on Arabiya television, Saudi-owned and Lebanese-run television, to Bashar al-Assad, I am ready to meet you anytime, anywhere to talk about peace.
He said this just a few days ago, right?
That's right. That's right. And the Syrian, no, you won't find a Syrian response in the normal media. But in reading the local media here, I've uncovered one particular response in what's called Al Watan newspaper, which is one of the new private sector newspapers in Syria, and it's also very close to the regime. And the response in the article basically went like this. It started out by criticizing Arabiya television for allowing Olmert on the television, and it basically said, "Oh, you Arabiya television, you hope to be the competitor with your rival Jazeera television from Qatar." And then it specifically leveled its charges at Saudi Arabia, and it said very clearly, and I'm summing it up here, so this is not a quote, but basically they said, so you want us to talk with the Israelis. Why don't you talk with the Israelis yourself? You have not included yourself in the quartet group, which is talking about Middle East peace. You are staying outside of it. And the Syrians concluded by saying, we know what our dealings with the Israelis have been over the last few years. It has not worked out very well for us. And basically that is the only response we have, and I think you can sum the whole thing up simply with the sort of lead paragraph of the word no.
Right.
And so I don't think we're going to be seeing any kind of peace talks directly with President Assad anytime soon. But
now,
that could change.
Let me just
in the region.
Sort of put some of that in context, or ask you about some of the context with it, because my understanding of the history of it is, so what we have right now is Olmert saying, hey, hey guys, let's talk whenever you want. And Syria is saying, not so much, right? There are sort of two things of context that struck me as particularly interesting. One is that what seems to be the kind of I don't know what you want to call it, the kind of lack of ultimate leadership in Israel of a kind of clear line, where, as I understand it, the foreign minister Livni said that actually she was against talking to Syria, so that you have this kind of almost divided government thing going on, which strikes me as is evidence of, Olmert's not, I mean, he's prime minister, but he has, his popularity rating is like, what, in the single digits or something? He doesn't exactly have a whole lot of credibility to launch big negotiations. But the other thing is this history of it. I'm curious of your take on it. Maybe mine is reductive or off base. And the history of that the U.S. has essentially, over the past few years, the Bush administration has been encouraging or supportive of, as I've read it, it's actually encouraging Israel not to talk to Syria. I mean, there have been these kind of reports, occasional reports that have come out where Israel has there have been this sort of reports of Israel being interested in talking, but basically saying, well, we don't want to step on the White House's toes, so we're not going to initiate any talks. So this interesting thing of where the administration, the Bush administration, becoming frankly an impediment to negotiations. Thoughts?
Well, the Bush administration.
Am I off base here? If I'm
no. I think you're very on base. The Bush administration's policy at times, and at least until Secretary Rice met her counterpart Walid Muallim on May 2nd, I think it was, on the sidelines of the Sharm el-Sheikh conference, basically was summed up. Their policy basically summed up that if you had any contact with those who opposed you, you somehow became dirty, and therefore it was not only counterproductive, but sent the wrong signals, and that there was nothing really that you could learn from what's going on in Syria. Now that policy has begun to change. We see a number of things happening here on the ground concerning. There is a U.S. embassy that functions here. It is without ambassador. The ambassador was
been without an ambassador for a couple of years now.
Since the day after Hariri was killed. The day after Hariri was killed, the U.S. ambassador was withdrawn. And we have.
So what are we seeing that's in the sort of in the more engagement realm?
Well, we have a very active charge d'affaires here, or we call it Deputy Chief of Mission (DCM), named Michael Corbin, and he is trying to drum up contacts with Syria. And again, it's that you have to gather, even if you oppose. I think that my biggest problem with the Bush administration is, many times concerning Syria's activities in the region, and specifically concerning, I think, its influence on what's been happening in Lebanon recently. I think they have a lot of things actually right. The problem, though, is how you go about dealing with it, and sometimes dealing with a problem involves talking to people who you don't agree with, and being, as James Baker says, being really hard-nosed with them, and Baker had some experience in that. Now, where this is all leading, I don't know. At the moment, we've seen some more public diplomacy activities here on the ground start up. We had the first 4th of July celebrations in probably 5 years occurred.
Ooh, exciting. How were those?
The Syrian authorities called up all the Syrians who were invited on the list and told them not to come. And it was a pretty small meeting. And we had also a Track 2 American delegation here.
Track 2 means what?
Track 2 means like non-official, some think tank folks from Washington who were in town for talks with another think tank here, very progressive stuff. And they were attending this, so they didn't get a chance to meet as many Syrians as they possibly could have, but a lot of Syrians still showed up, and actually, in the end, I think a lot of people are taking a closer look at Syria. It's certainly a place worth taking a closer look at, and not ignoring what's going on here, and specifically what's going on here on the ground. It's been a pretty confusing couple of years. Basically the Bush administration has pursued a policy here of promoting democracy, and basically sort of low-level regime change. Since even before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, but it came into force certainly later in 2003. The problem is that the United States was unable to reach out to people here on the ground in an effective way, and they backed a number of people who were in the Syrian exiled opposition, which is located in Brussels and also in Washington, D.C. And so they kind of left the opposition and the Syrian people here to themselves, and while they applied pressures on the regime, well, because they didn't have sort of an American buoy thrown to them during this time, when the pressures came down on Syria, the regime was able to turn these things around and turn them into nationalist issues. And when things really got bad for Syria and Lebanon and it was forced to pull out, the regime manipulated those statements as well, especially by a lot of statements by Lebanese, and it pushed many Syrians and the regime together. Not all of them, but many of them. And then, of course, the icing on the cake was last summer's war, where the United States backed Israel, and Israel spent a lot of time bombing civilian areas from which Hezbollah were launching attacks on Israel. So it was a very difficult situation. And Syrians not only saw this on television, but they directly dealt with this because Syria accepted hundreds of thousands of Lebanese refugees into Syria during the war. And it was not the Syrian government, it was not the Ba'athist state that dealt with these refugee issues, it was the private sector, which, because of a very strong sense of community and a trading spirit that goes back millennia, to maybe even the Silk Road, basically has fended for itself and welcomed these people into their homes, and dealt with a humanitarian crisis in a very effective way. And seeing someone bombing civilians, seeing the Israelis bomb civilians with American acquiescence, made them mad as hell, and many of them no longer support U.S. policy. And again, I haven't said a word here about the backdrop of all of this, and that is the carnage we see resonating out of Iraq every day. So It wasn't hard to convince the average Syrian that rising up against this regime wasn't going to work, and that the United States was not going to come and rescue them anytime soon.
Right. And so, I mean, it seems to me that there are a couple of things. I mean, just to put it together, and that is, even when this talk that we were talking about earlier in terms of the Golan, there's something about, I mean, this is a kind of classic authoritarian move, or move of authoritarian regimes, but of, engendering, building support for yourself, by sort of focusing on the foreign enemy, right?
That's correct.
Right.
Yeah,
so,
it's a sort of it basically is a very crude European state-building model. And that is, the American, it's hard for Americans to understand. Our state was not built off of war with external enemies. We did have wars with some enemies, but European state-building model, i.e. how European states were built, was primarily off of war with enemies, territorial disputes, other kinds of things which rallied people around the flag, and allowed the elites in those countries to amass resources, and basically to define what kind of activities were permitted and not permitted.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing in Syria. In Syria, is the master of this, because the state was very badly formed by the French after the First World War, and that allowed a lot of different ideologies which have territorial ambitions to take hold in Syria. I mean, we'd only have Baathism, which wants to unite the entire Arab world and sees the entire Arab world, should be one state, and therefore justifies activities in the Palestinian territories, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and so on. But then, if you take that away, if they signed a paper that said Baathism is over, you would have what's called Greater Syrianism, and which is called Kalmi Suri. And Greater Syrianism that includes today's Syria, parts of Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, the Palestinian territories, Jordan, and Cyprus. Cyprus. Then, when that's over, you have what's called Bilad Sham, which goes with the countries of Damascus, which goes back to the Ottoman times, which basically encompasses the number of the countries I just talked about, minus Cyprus. So, there isn't an alternative ideology sort of floating around. There isn't a sort of Syria first, kind of ideology just yet. And in order for and now, the reason how the regime is able to use this is that they use the fact that they're in a technical state of war with Israel and that the Golan is occupied to invoke what's something that's called the emergency law. The emergency law
since 1963 or some such.
Okay, it was invoked. It was invoked in March of 1963 because of internal instability. Syria used to be one of the most unstable countries in the world before the Assad family came to power. And the Assad regime has since turned it around and now justifies the emergency law because Israel occupies the Golan and because of this external threat from Israel. What the emergency law allows the regime to do on the ground is to detain people without charge indefinitely. And when I mean indefinitely, I don't just mean a few months, which happens recently, and most of the time now it's a few weeks or a month. And then they're finally charged and then they're tried. But in the 1980s, this was used to detain a number of members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and some of those people, specifically who were rounded up in 1982, 1983, just disappeared.
Yeah.
So, and we never heard from them again. So, of course, this is a major fear element that the regime can keep over people's heads. And so peace with Israel would pull the rug out from under the emergency law. Now, what kind of ideology you would fall back on in Syria, I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I suppose you could probably just conjure up some kind of other thread. But in any case...
But this is...
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. This is this notion that I find very interesting, that peace with Israel, and I've read about this a little bit, but this sort of theory that peace with Israel and kind of re-engagement overall could be counterproductive for Assad, ultimately, right? I mean, in other words, that they could certainly perceive it that way. He could certainly perceive it that way. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I think, even President Assad would, I think he has admitted this, or he probably would admit it. Look, Syria is not Switzerland, and he knows that this is an absolute it's an absolute dictatorship. So, peace with Israel would mean the same kind of things that Anwar Sadat had to pull off between 1979 and 1981. Okay, everybody remembers the tripartite handshake between Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin, and Anwar Sadat at Camp David in the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Now, what happened after that was that Egypt withdrew its emergency law. It had its own emergency law, which had been in place more or less since 1948. It withdrew its emergency law and started to issue a number of domestic reforms around the concept of Egyptianness, which is the current ideology of the regime of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. This didn't work so well, and progress on settling the Palestinian issue, which was promised after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, ran the rocks. So a number of intellectuals in Egypt rebelled against and started speaking out against Anwar Sadat, and he just put them in jail. And this was what was called the Autumn of Fury in 1981 in Egypt, and led to Anwar Sadat's assassination by Islamic militants. The emergency law went back into place, this time justified off of a domestic threat. So navigating this this kind of change politically for an Arab dictator is very tricky stuff, and I think it would be very, very tricky for Bashar al-Assad to pull it off. He might be able to do it. I think ideologically, I don't see any counter ideology, Syrianness or whatever you would call it, within the current bounds of the country we call Syria, for the regime to fall back on. So exactly what would be gained out of signing a deal, I don't know. But it's not. It's worth exploring. It's worth checking out.
You mean it's worth the U.S. and Israel exploring whether he would be interested, is what you're saying?
It's worth checking that they're interested. And also, I think that, like James Baker said, and I think he probably is the best versed on this, for the simple reason he had a lot of experience in doing it, and some of the people around him at the time and after the Gulf War of 1990-91, that is, you've got to be really hard-nosed. Now remember, the peace negotiations started in 1991 at Madrid, and in the case of Syria, they ended in 2000 without a deal.
Right.
So the opponents of engaging the Syrian regime would say, well, the Syrians only want this for the process. They only want the process of negotiating, and they will do nothing. Well, they might have a point. So this might encourage a lot of American negotiators and Israeli negotiators to sort of speed everything up and basically put everything on the table to Assad and say, okay, this is what we have. We're willing to pull out completely. We are willing to observe these things. Can you do a deal? If Assad can't do a deal, then I don't think it's worth expending an entire decade on it and waiting for the political door to open while you don't explore other doors.
Yeah, as I understand it, by the way, I mean realistically, and this is I think you cited it in your blog. There's this Chatham House report just out about Syria, which is what is Chatham House, by the way? An open intel type place?
It's like a think tank. It's a British think tank. It was probably one of the first, and they started what's called the Chatham House rules, which are often used at American think tanks, and that is that anything that's discussed in their sessions is not for publication or quotation.
Well, anyway, so they had this report, and the upshot that I got from it was essentially that Assad and Syria overall is whether or not he's ultimately interested in making a deal with Israel, that basically playing a waiting game now, because just waiting out, Bush is going to be gone. Bush obviously doesn't appear to be overly interested in a deal, if you could put it that way. And in terms of Israel, their politics are a mess right now. With Omar, as we were talking about before, he doesn't have the the capital right now to make a deal. So you might as well wait it out. I mean, that was the one sentence time version that I got, and it seemed to make sense to me as a kind of reasonable the logic of it.
Yeah. The Assad regime is they are the masters of the waiting game. They can stretch things out for unbelievable amounts of time. And if you'll notice, a lot of times you're led down the garden path.
You're led down what?
The garden path. The British call the garden path. What I mean is that it's a lot of wishful thinking. The current folks who are invoking wishful thinking are the Turks. Turkey is currently very closely related and in bed, kind of in terms of political initiatives and economic initiatives, with Syria. After nearly going to war in 1998 over Syria's hosting of the Kurdish militant group, the PKK, in Damascus. So now they have resolved that Syria and Turkey are trading. They have a free trade agreement. They have they have very close political ties. But the problem is that if you look closely, Syria and Turkey have a territorial dispute over what Turkey calls Hatay. It's like the little piece of Turkey that hangs down on the end of the eastern Mediterranean, and what the Syrians call the Liwa Iskenderun, which is called, which we call in English the former Sanjak of Alexandretta, which is where Antioch is located. Now, if you look closely, all of these relations are going forward, and everybody's really happy. There is no signed agreement on settling the issue of who owns Hatay, Syria, or Turkey. They just brushed it over and forgot about it. Now,
which is to say
that the Syrian regime is masters at leading you down the garden path, thinking that you have the issue settled. But then, of course, at a later date, they can reinvoke this problem, political problem, and trash everything that you've done so far in the name of this still ongoing territorial dispute with Syria. Right. There is no reason why this dispute can't be settled now. And it's up to Ankara to decide whether they want to go to these kind of negotiations. It might be worth it in terms of security cooperation with Syria. I don't think Israel would accept similar kinds of initiatives.
It's kind of open-ended,
This is not going to happen. This is not going to happen, and it would be very, very difficult. So keeping these kind of things open and the Israelis putting themselves in a place where they have to worry about a basic fundamental of a piece of territory that they currently occupy would be out of the question. So I'm kind of pessimistic. I don't really think that we're going to see major progress soon. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. But it would be very interesting to see what will come out of this. It seems like it's all kind of bottomed out, that it's a lot of bellicose talk. Both sides say that they're not interested in something. But if something goes wrong in Lebanon this time, if Hezbollah and Israel start shooting at each other, or if whoever starts firing more rockets across the Israeli frontier, which we saw a couple weeks ago from southern Lebanon, I think the conflict this time will involve Syria. I don't think there's any reason to think that it would just involve Lebanon like last time. And what will happen after that, I don't know.
Let's have a bracket here for my mother not to watch that comment or listen to that comment.
I hope so. I hope she misses that. Well, we're 42 minutes into the session, so hopefully she would have gone off to have some coffee.
Yeah, very few people. 42 minutes in, very few people. So let me ask you, this is something that I've just actually been curious about for a while, and that is in terms of, there's something like, 500,000 Iraqi refugees in Syria now?
They say 1.2 million. I'm not exactly sure. Yeah.
Maybe I was reading about just Damascus or some such.
It could be, but we have a number of Iraqi refugees in Damascus. I mean, the recent IMF Article 4 report on Syria said that Syria grew about 7% in 1 year. And we've certainly seen the effect of that in prices on agricultural products, basic agricultural products, and also on rents here in Damascus. In fact, my rent has gone up substantially and is not making me very happy. But you see a lot of people who are suffering quite a bit.
Right.
And you see a lot of Iraqis in the street, and I hear a lot of Iraqi accents being spoken around me.
So, well, there are two things. One is this makes for a very bad apartment situation, I believe, for me. Which would have to be dealt with. But it's really raised the price of real estate, and correct?
That's right.
All right. So moving away from me for just a moment, I'm actually. It also is. I'm just curious, and maybe you have some thoughts on this, on the regime's sort of calculation in terms of Iraqi refugees. Is it a situation where it's just logistically it's difficult to hold them out anyway? Do they see some sort of, or is it that they see some sort of positive leverage that they get out of it, that they could get good PR out of it, that it's just a kind of historical thing of allowing in refugees? Is there? Because it seems to me to be that's a significant burden, and frankly, I would imagine in some sense risk for a regime in terms of stability and letting in so many people and so forth. So, do you sense any sort of particular? What's the sort of reasoning behind it, if there is any?
Yeah. I think it's a function of the ideology of the regime. The regime here advocates something which is called Aruba. Aruba is Arabism, and Arabism basically says, and any person coming from an Arab country with an Arab passport can get into Syria without a visa. It has always seen itself as the heart of the Arab world and the welcoming mother of the Arab world. They're probably right. I mean, it's the one thing that they've been able to play in the region to their advantage, and they are this time as well. Is it a card to use against the United States? Certainly it is. It is an absolute black eye for the United States that up to 1.2 million Iraqis decided to pick up sticks and leave and go to, neighboring Ba'athist Syria to escape the carnage of the American democratic experiment. It's a disgrace. So basically, it's a card against the United States. It gains a tremendous amount of political capital and soft, or maybe I think it's not only soft power in the Arab world, but smart power. People appreciate what Syria is doing. It doesn't mean the regimes in the Arab world are appreciating what Syria is doing. They're certainly not.
Right.
But the people in the Arab world are appreciating it. They're appreciating what Iran's doing as well. And this has been causing a lot of problems between a lot of sort of political shakeup or some tremors in the region that have a number of political leaders, specifically Sunni political leaders in the region, sitting on the edge of their seats.
When you're talking about they appreciate what Iran is doing, you mean in terms of what? In standing up to the U.S. or stuff?
Yes, standing up to the U.S., but also the Iranians pump a lot of money into Syria, and then Syria pumps a lot of money into areas like Hamas-controlled areas of the Gaza Strip, into parts of Lebanon, of course, with Hezbollah. The Iranians are sort of reaching out like never before, as many people are saying.
This is so it's essentially like the street cred factor. I mean, is that?
That's right. I mean, the Iranians are playing a very smart, and so are the Syrians, what we call a public diplomacy campaign.
Yeah.
I don't think it's just diplomacy. I think probably the better word for it is some kind of smart power. It's not soft power. It's like smart power. It's kind of a combination of sticks and carrots, military and investment. It works, and we're seeing it working now. And unfortunately, the United States is unable to implement any of it because of the sort of very black and white way that we see the region at the moment. And hopefully, with the new administration, that'll change.
Right. Well, you're talking about what, like further engagement in? Actually, forget about the broad question. This is. I'll tell you this sort of thing that always struck me as an enormous opportunity missed, and I just was aware I was looking at these stats, but in terms of southern Lebanon and rebuilding there, and it looks like the U.S. has actually not given chump change. It's given something like $100 million. I think these are Lebanese government numbers, which I can't remember where I got them from or where I saw them from. But something like the U.S. has donated something like $100 million. Saudi Arabia has gone to roughly $600 million, and there weren't any numbers from Iran or Syria because because it was Lebanese government numbers, so they just didn't get included in the count. But
Right.
I'm curious in terms of looking at. I'm trying to make a segue here. I'm curious in terms of looking at the rebuilding and southern Lebanon, and if rebuilding has this huge kind of essentially public diplomacy component, how you grade the various sides, and particularly the U.S. and the other thing I saw we could talk about is I actually saw something from Hannah, I think it's Alam, who's from McClatchy's, and I think it's her Cairo bureau chief. Their Cairo bureau chief.
That's
now.
correct. That's right.
Who was suggesting basically that Hezbollah hasn't exactly done a bang-up job in terms of rebuilding either in the south. So that's a lot to chew on, but
sure. the United States has reached out to the government of Fuad Sonora, which it supports in Beirut, and that government in Beirut opposes. It's called the opposition, which is led by Hezbollah and a number of other parties in Lebanon. The United States has deployed several hundreds of millions of dollars in aid assistance to Lebanon.
Hundreds of millions, really?
I think over the last couple of years, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's been escalating especially the last couple of years, including military aid and so on. Actually, to be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure on that figure, so listeners should.
Well, I know that when there was this recent fight against the jihadi militants, that the U.S. sent in some sort of emergency armament, but I don't know. I didn't know about civilian aid. So,
we've had civilian aid going back into the 90s. We had a number of projects. The problem. Well, we have a couple of problems. One is that the U.S. is probably unable to affect itself in southern Lebanon because Hezbollah does not go in. The Lebanese government is in quite a bind. For a long time, the policies of the Lebanese government were so dependent on political patronage that basic services were not extended outside of Beirut into poorer areas, especially into the south where the Shia lived. And then the Shia only consist of 21% of parliament members in the Lebanese parliament. They do have the Speaker of Parliament is a Shia, but they only have 21%. And despite the fact that they are probably a full third or over a full third of the population. And they basically, the assumption is that they've been sort of kept down. And the Lebanese system has sort of kept them down. And by not dealing with this problem, by simply holding a census, which they have not held since, I think it was in the 1920s, but I could be wrong. Maybe it was 1930s.
Yeah.
Anyways, it's way, way back. And so basically, by not holding this census and again, not settling this issue, leaving things open-ended, going down the garden path, it basically has allowed has caused the Shia population to become quite angry, and they were then, of course, they fell into the hands of Iran during the Israelis' invasion of 1982 of Lebanon, and since grew into Hezbollah.
By the way, just to provide listeners with a little bit of context, as I understand it, many Shia initially supported, this is just to give a little bit of context, many Shia initially supported the Israeli invasion in 82.
That's right.
Because it would throw out these Palestinians who were basically encroaching on their land. Just to give you how things twist around, right? So, anyway.
Because oftentimes the invasions and the occupations of things, as we've seen in Iraq, go terribly wrong. It's very hard for the occupying force to differentiate between different parties. And what it's allowed is that it's allowed outside powers to come in and manipulate these people who feel an injustice in the Lebanese system, and to militarize them, and to get them to sacrifice oftentimes their lives to attack Israel. And the fact of the matter is that they were credited with bringing about the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon in May 2000, which bolstered Hezbollah. It has not transformed them into a political party. There is still the disputed, what's called the Shebaa Farms, which a report came out this last week saying that UN cartographers think that it actually is Lebanese territory and that Israel should evacuate from it. Really? Yeah, it's just like Now, listen, Hezbollah will find another way to perpetuate the fight anyway. They already talk about what's called the 7 disputed villages around the border. So this will go on. But anyways, so, you might see an Israeli evacuation from the Shebaa Farm sometime. There was even some talk that if the Israelis evacuated the Shebaa Farms, that in the event that Syria would put a trade blockade on Lebanon, that the Lebanese could then ship goods to Jordan overland through the occupied Golan Heights through the Shebaa Farms, if the Israelis evacuated. So we're in for a pretty busy spring. Very busy summer and fall. in terms of those kind of things. God only knows where it's going to go.
That is, it's a sort of a sad way to end it, but might be a reasonable way to end it. You're, as I understand it, running short on time. Is that correct?
That's right. I have another interview I have to carry out here in a few minutes' time. But
a wanted man in Damascus. I mean,
a wanted man in Damascus. Sometimes, actually, I'm trying to write. Actually, for writers out there, I'm on deadline, and the hardest place to concentrate in the world is Damascus. So if you want to concentrate and get things done, don't come here. If you want to learn Arabic, great place to come. If you want to learn about the Arab world and what's going on right now, also a great place to come. But if you want to try and get something done and push yourself, it's not easy.
What is this? Is it like a party place? Is that what we're talking about?
No, well, there is that. There are a lot more foreigners here now than there were in the past. It used to be, when I first came here, it was just, in terms of Americans, it was just me, the guys who worked for ConocoPhillips, and the people in the embassy. Now we have scores of Americans, if not hundreds, maybe not hundreds, but yeah, certainly 50 to 75 Americans learning Arabic. Europeans.
It's a wave.
It's a wave of people. You know what? It's a great place to learn Arabic. It's a great place. Syria is a great place, and really, if you come here and you understand the place, the potential of this country is enormous. I mean, it has granted its own dwindling oil and gas resources. It's generally self-sufficient agriculture, although we have a drought this year. The people are literate. They're serious. They're trading people. They have an entrepreneurial tradition going back, thousands of years actually.
Do you also happen to work for the Ministry of Tourism?
No, I don't actually. It's a great place to visit tourist sites as well. But actually, it is a fantastic place. It could be a great place. But unfortunately, the political situation is such that I don't think it's going to be maximizing its potential anytime soon. Short of a major shift in regional politics, which, are things that are decided well outside of the bounds of the small office I'm in right now.
Okay, so assuming there is no war in the next 72 hours.
Let's hope not.
Let's hope not. I should be seeing you soon.
Okay.
And, yeah.
I look forward to it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I will. I'll see you here in Damascus. And thank you very much for your time today.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Bye bye.